Today I want to talk about Philo of Alexandria. We've already talked about Wisdom of Solomon and the major Greek influence on that work. Well, in Philo, we get a really pivotal figure in the Jewish community in the diaspora, and in some ways the stepping stone between some of the ideas of wisdom and the idea of logos in the New Testament. So Philo, he came from a very prominent family in the Alexandrian community. This was a very, very powerful ethnic population within the city of Alexandria, and we date him approximately from 15 BCE to 50 CE. So in many ways he was a contemporary of Jesus, but in Egypt. So he's part of this Egyptian diaspora. He comes from, like I said, a very prominent family. His brother was the head or the major customs official at the port of Alexandria, which of course would have been a very profitable and important post, and his nephew served for a while as the governor of Egypt. And then we get the sense with the nephew that here was a person who had turned his back on his Jewish faith and had become completely acculturated. But Philo himself, even though he was trained in Greek thinking and Greek philosophy and Greek philosophical categories were his framework, he still remained a devout Jew. And so this is the man who tries to really thoroughly integrate the Greek and the Jewish world. So the community of Alexandria, I've made mention of it, was founded in 331 by Alexander the Great, and very quickly many Jews of the diaspora went there. So it, all sorts of mercenaries, merchants, students, the whole bit, and the Jewish community was the third most powerful community in the city after the Greek and the Egyptian populations. So that's saying a lot, considering that this was a big port city. One of the things we do know, though, in the 1st century CE, that when Alexandria went from Greek control, or should I say Ptolemaic control, to Roman control, things became a little less pleasant. The Romans were not as sort of hands-off as the Ptolemaic rulers were, and so there were problems, and there was a major persecution of the Jews that occurred in 38 CE, and we know a lot of about this because Philo himself writes about it. He is one of the men chosen by the Jewish community in Alexandria to form a delegation to go to the Roman emperor and to appeal for order and calm in the city. So as a writer, a thinker, and here we can really say this man was a thinker, a philosopher of Greek thinking and categories. Given his wealth and prominence, he was educated and had time to do scholarly kinds of things. And as a thinker or philosopher, his goal, as in so many of the diaspora writings, was to defend Judaism, the centrality of Judaism, the importance of Judaism, the superiority of Judaism over the Greek polytheistic cultures of Yahweh and the faith of the Jewish people. So and even and he puts it, and not just to defend it, but he says that Jewish philosophy, the philosophy of Judaism, so to speak, to sort of take the categories and the ways that Judaism talks about God in the world, thinking of it as a philosophy, the philosophy of Judaism is superior to all Greek philosophy as well. So this is very much a part of his statement. But the thing is, that's not an easy task because they are so different and hard to reconcile. But in many ways, he was an apologist for Judaism. The idea of not as in I'm sorry, but an apologist as someone who produces written defense of the faith. This is what he did for his brand of Judaism. The eventually, however, his writings, well, there are 49 extant writings of Philo. So he was very, very prolific. There was more. This is just what survived. There are three basic categories that he wrote in. One was exegetical, so expositions or study of the scripture. Philosophical, so where he spoke of Judaism but using Greek philosophical categories and not the scripture as its base. And then there are some of his historical historical writings. This would include the description of the persecution in Egypt in 38 and things like that. So they have a lot of his there's a lot of his writing still to be left, and so even though he was a defender of Judaism, however, it is the Christian church, or it is the church, Christianity, that has preserved Philo, and he has been powerfully influential on Christianity, especially Origen and the idea of allegorical interpretation of the Bible. But again, Judaism rejected this what they would consider syncretistic version of Judaism that was too acculturated to Greek ways of thinking. And so we go back to, Jamnia and the Pharisaic tradition. They just outright rejected Philo and his writing. So he is not, again, not a hero of the Jewish tradition anymore. His most famous the most famous aspects of his work for Christianity have to do with two things. One, he pioneered the allegorical interpretation of Scripture. So the idea of allegorical interpretation is that what is actually being said is not what is actually being meant. And this is the form of interpretation that dominated Christian readings of the Old Testament in particular, well into the medieval period, probably up into the Enlightenment and the Reformation, when the church sort of changed course. But the other then, so if this is one, two, the second is the idea of the Logos. He talks about this figure named the Logos, and so again, the two most important elements: allegory, or the allegorical readings of the text, and two, the idea of the Logos, which is of course the Greek word for word. And we find in Philo the stepping stone between the Old Testament idea of wisdom, as it's through Sirach, and then wisdom of Solomon. So the as we find, well, let me say, sorry to be so confusing on the writing here, but we get the woman wisdom in Proverbs, We go to Sirach, and Wisdom of Solomon, where she becomes clearly an apostatess, and all of this becomes influential, but it is all of this is influential on Philo and his interpretation of this figure named Logos, and you can see this being carried into the Gospel of John, and the idea of the Word or the Logos in John 1. So, very, very, very important figure for us in connecting the Jewish thinking to Christian thinking. So, what Philo is difficult. There is no way that, let me just write it. Philo is difficult. It takes a lot of practice, a lot of understanding of Greek philosophy and of Scripture to be able to completely and fully just make sense of Philo. And his writings are so spread out. There's so many of them that to get a full picture of him, it just takes a lot of work. And so I want to just give us a skim down version of his influences and how he then influenced Christianity. So basically, he is very much influenced by Stoic philosophy and by Plato. He is a big fan of Plato. And so you can see elements of both of these philosophies, of both of these thinkers in his work. And the more you understand this, the more you understand Philo. So his categories come out of Greek philosophical world. So having said that, I'm going to point out an oversimplification of where the Stoic and the Platonic thought affects Philo and his thinking about Judaism. So I want to start with I want to talk about two ideas of Philo. One is comes from Stoic philosophy. Stoicism, as an ancient Greek philosophy, searched for what they would call the law of nature. And so or natural law, which becomes a part of even Western philosophical traditions, well into, so for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so natural law is this concept that above and beyond culture, there are some really fundamental rules of order of society. So some things are wrong because they're culturally wrong. So, I've been overseas where it's wrong for a woman to wear a pair of pants or to wear makeup. She might be shunned if that was the case. That is a cultural law. But then underneath that, are there laws that just form the basis of all human experience and behavior? And that's what the Stoics were trying to find. So culture, no. And they recognize the difference. So what might these fundamental laws be? So this is where we then get to Philo, who took this Stoic philosophy and said that natural law, all that the Stoics were looking for, was actually the law of Moses. So he says that all the fundamental at the structural level of creation, what is it that we are to do and to be? And he said, stop looking for it, guys. It's the law of Moses. So the Jews understood and had access to this revealed truth, but that revealed truth was indeed this natural law that the Greco-Roman world had been looking for. So here you can see then how Philo argues for the superiority of all of Judaism, because while they're still seeking it, the Jews already have it. So all philosophy, then, another way to put it is all philosophy is found in and derives from the Torah. And you may be thinking, wow, wouldn't have thought that that's what the law of Moses was all about. You look at the Pentateuch or the Torah, there are the story of creation, also the stories of the patriarchs. There is not a lot of what you and I might think of as philosophy in the Greco-Roman categories of philosophy. So how does, Philo go from the law of nature and equating it to the Torah? Well, he does it allegorically, or to say that the Torah is to be read allegorically. So what that means then is, like allegory is what they actually say isn't necessarily the full or even the meaning of what we're trying to say in a story. So he did, Philo would say that there was meaning at the literal level of the text. So when Moses talks about making, being at Mount Sinai, or the plagues, the crossing of the Red Sea, that is truth, but really it's just a very, very faint, transparent form of the truth, because the real meaning is found. He saw no meaning at the historical level that would help the believer, but rather read it allegorically. And to boil it all down is, so the historical level is secondary. To boil it all down, then, the Torah is really about the journey of the soul. So it is all an allegorical way of talking about how the individual person's soul moves from creation, or its existence, beginning of its existence, and is emancipated or freed from the distractions of earth, so earthly distractions pull on the soul, but the journey of the Torah talks about our emancipation or freedom from earthly distractions and our ultimate reunion or union with the divine, the soul's union with the divine. And again, the promised land then is our union with God. So we begin with creation, we go and we are distracted, all these things, and it's an easy thing to say, but it's very complicated to do, and it can be quite eye-crossing to try and follow Philo through his interpretation of Scripture. It is not at all where you and I would go, but it's all based on his Greekness, his Hellenism, and his view of the world. So in some sense, this is, I don't think that today we would feel all that comfortable with what he's doing, but it very much fits in with our own Christian heritage. And so a couple more things would add to this is the idea that the idea of the soul's movement towards God But it for Philo, two things to note. This was not speculative, purely speculative, but highly ethical. And here's where his Judaism really, really shines through, that there is a moral and ethical framework for the soul's journey, more than just being united with God. And then, interestingly, because he was a devout Jew, as I've said a couple times, that he believed in the rituals. So he did not allegorize everything, but the practice of the faith was important. So it wasn't merely a head kind of thing, a mental kind of thing, but there were definite day-to-day applications and lifestyle choices that come from his allegorical reading. So again, the Stoic influence here, this is a very sort of, this is not a very deep reading of Philo, but it'll give you a sense of who he is. And to connect from the Stoic to this idea of natural law to the law. You see the Stoics, the idea of natural law, and the idea of the Torah as the revealed natural law, which the Jews received first, and this ultimate path of the individual soul, very much directed by the concerns of Jewish tradition, ethics and practice. So the ultimate this is the ultimate defense of Judaism as a philosophy or as a religion, is to say that, all you Greeks over there, you've been searching for this and for this and for that and all this, and we've had it for centuries and we practice it. And so we are therefore that we are better. And so it is a defense of Judaism, very definitely. Again, a defense of Judaism that Jews ultimately did not adhere to and rejected. But it's quite a piece of intellectual ability in its, in what Philo does. So I also then wanted to talk about the idea of the logos, which is, I think, in many ways more interesting to the Christian tradition. Well, allegory is very much a part of the Christian tradition, so I don't want to say that logos is more interesting. But the idea of the logos is so fascinating for us, particularly based on the Gospel of John and the use of that in the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, with a capital W. And so how do we talk about, or how did Philo come to this idea of the logos? And it's very much based on Greek categories, and it's probably because of that, this is why his conceptualization of the logos becomes so important to Christians, because the Christian tradition very quickly, if you think about the early Christians, they were mostly Gentiles. So here, the idea of being able to blend Greek thought and Jewish thought, this was very appealing to the Christian tradition. And so at least part of the reason why Philo is so popular. So in order to really talk about the logos, we have to start with Plato. And so the great philosopher Plato, who was having a revival of his thinking during this time, but also the Greek idea of a separation between the body and the soul, or the sensory world and the intellectual, or the world of the mind. And there was a separation. Sometimes it's referred to as the body and the soul, the sensory versus the intellectual. But there was definitely, this is definitely not Jewish, but very, very definitely part of the Greek world and part of the thinking that folds over into Christianity. So this belief in a division between the physical or the sensory, the things that come to us through our physical senses, and the things that come to us through, they understood a more abstract way, through our mind. So I want to talk about Plato's myth of the cave, because this really sort of forms a part of the background. And if you Google this, there's some great explanations online, all sorts of sources. But the myth of the cave is how he explains this difference, and not only explains the difference, but argues for the superiority of this part of who we are, the soul or the mind. So in the myth or the allegory of the cave, there you have to imagine an experience where there are people who are chained in a cave, and they are completely immobilized so that they can only look straight forward. They can't turn their head at all, and they certainly can't look behind them. Between them and the outside world is a fire, and as things move by the mouth of the cave, it casts shadows on the wall. So, if this is, you've got people facing this way and they can only look at the cave, and this is the outside world, and it's casting shadows on this wall here. And so, as Plato would say, if the only thing you can see are the shadows, then the shadow is your reality, right? If that is the only thing you can see, the shadow is your reality. But what happens if someone escapes, gets to leave the cave, and then sees the sun and the physical world, and realizes that there is something much that all that he saw was not false, but definitely not fully real. So the idea then of we and our sensory selves are like these prisoners who can only see the shadows on the wall, the reflections, that's another way that they put it, the reflections of reality, but not reality itself. And so you've probably heard this, it's very popular, the idea of the Platonic ideal, but the idea that there is, what we see is, and what we experience in the physical world is a reflection of some greater truth, some greater reality in the heavens. So Plato then sets up this, in Greek thinking, sets up for Philo this idea of a separation between the body and the spirit. By the way, this is not Gnosticism. Whoops. Make that go away. Which some of you may know enough about to know Gnosticism is really a movement that doesn't come about for another century or so. But it is, I think, part of Christianity to understand this body-soul division. But it's not particularly Jewish, but it comes to us through the Greek influence on Christianity. So, having said that, let me erase that. The Septuagint, by the way, translates in Exodus 3, the word Yahweh. The phrase is translated as, the way that Philo would say, is the unoriginate, or, I know that's a strange word, but I am the one who is. and it does this, in this sort of formulation lends itself more to the Greek understanding of a transcendent God who is completely unknowable, unoriginate, before origins, even before divisions. This idea of a transcendent God who, and so this is something that the Greek world and the Jewish world shared in common, was an understanding of a God who transcends all reality, is unknowable by us. Now, Judaism would, and Christianity says that God chooses to be made known, and that is how we know. But the idea of a transcendent God is something they share in common. But the problem for Philo, so what are the problems for Philo in trying to, among many, of the synthesis that he is trying to create between Judaism and Jewish categories and Greek categories? And one of them has to do with how this understanding of transcendence, how you understand transcendence. Because in the Old Testament, God may be transcendent, but there's a strong sensory or physical aspect to the God of the Old Testament. He interacts with people, he is seen, he speaks. So this just doesn't make sense to the Greek. And so this is at least part of another thing that's solved by the problem by allegorical interpretation. But there's a deeper level than just how do you interpret it when you talk about God in this way as transcendent, and yet something that can be perceived by our physical and our sensory selves, not just our mind or our soul. And so what does Philo do with this? Well, the Greeks, let's put it this way, the Greeks deal with this easily because they're polytheists. So if you attribute something to the divine that is not purely of the mental or the soul, the non-physical world, you've got demigods, you've got demons, you've got all sorts of things like that. But you can't do that in Judaism, because in Judaism, the unity of God is paramount. So, again, the problems of this synthesis. So we go back to the Septuagint, and the word, when God speaks, like in Genesis 1, and it was the word, that is the word, yes, in passages like Genesis 1, where it says, and God spoke, or and when God speaks, this is the word that gets used. So this is how the word logos gets interpreted or pulled into the conversation, because some of it is just the word choice that Philo made that made this connection. And so to jump ahead, basically what Philo does in order to preserve the transcendence of God in a Greek sense, and yet at the same time talk about this earthy creator God of the Old Testament, he weds this idea of the logos with the idea of Chokmah, and specifically Chokmah as an hypostasis. So, by the time you get to Wisdom of Solomon, which at the very least is contemporary, but probably a generation before, we have Chokmah, wisdom, being a full-blown emanation or an entity that somehow exists, created by God, but somehow exists separately from God. And so you take this idea, the speech of God, the logos, you wed it with the idea, this particular idea of wisdom, and you get logos then as a separate entity, something with a separate existence from God, that, and yet at the same time is the will of God, the purpose of God. So, you take the Jewish understanding of Chokmah, particularly in books like Wisdom of Solomon, and it's as a hypostasis. You bring that into, you connect it with the creative force of God, which books like Wisdom of Solomon already do to a certain extent. Philo sees the creative force of God being the Word, and so you get Logos as a separate entity, in some ways that exists separately from God. So that's skipping to the end. But what does this? How does this solve? What is it? How does it solve the problem for Philo of the transcendent God in Greek terms versus a transcendent God and yet a very earthy, creative God in the Jewish tradition? And so this is, because to put it another way, the transcendent God of the Greek philosophy can't draw near or touch or manipulate the physical world because they are separate. So how can the transcendent God also be a creator God is another way to put it. So this is how Philo solves it in a very, very simplistic explanation. Philo is not simplistic. The explanation is, we go back to the story of creation. In the beginning was the Word, God created. Creation, day one, then, God created, in a sense, a blueprint. So day one is a blueprint. God basically thought the world. And then days 2 through 6 are the actual creation. So the Logos then, or as Philo would say, the blueprint, to use, that was created on the first day, is the Logos. So the Logos is both the thing and the creative force that creates the thing. So Logos is the is both creation and the power of creation, perfectly representing God's mind and yet separate from God, who acts as a creative power. And here again, why it becomes so attractive to Christianity. You have this unknowable God, but this unknowable God is, what we can know about this unknowable God is the Logos. So we see reflections So it's the creative power of God. It is separate from God, at least in the sense that the transcendent God does not come near and literally create. And that when we look at the Logos, we see all that we need to see and to know about God. So wisdom as an emanation of God, as an hypostasis, becomes not just a creation of God under Philo, but the blueprint of all creation, and you can see also in some ways a mediator. So there is God. God is unknowable. There is just absolute nothing. where people are down here. So when we look to God, we can't see God, but God creates the logos, and so we can see the logos. And so in some ways, from our own, puny little human way, we can see God. And the logos, then, you can see how it moves on both representative, creative power. So it becomes the sort of the representative of God, the creative power of God, and that which stands between us and an unknowable God. And so you can see how this influenced the Christian understanding, particularly as found in the Gospel of John, of the Logos in John 1. So that is, like I said, a simple explanation, but it's a good working explanation of Philo, unless you're willing to spend a lot of time trying to figure out who he is.